Hello everyone, and welcome to the third video in the series focusing on women in anticipation of the holiday of Shavuot. Today I would like to travel ahead. We've spent the last two videos focusing on biblical women, one being Miriam and the second being Vashti. Today I would like to look at a woman from the 2nd century of the Common Era, whose name was Bruriah, a wise, sagely exceptional individual who rose above the limitations of her age and was recognized as one of the most respected Jewish thinkers and sages of all time. First of all, just a little bit of background. Bruriah did not have a pleasant past. Her life was really filled with a great deal of tragedy. She was the daughter of Hananiah ben Tradion, who was one of the 10 Jewish martyrs executed by the Romans during the time around the revolt against Rome led by Bar Kokhba. The story about Hananiah or Hanina ben Tradion is told in this very moving text that we read as part of the martyrology on Yom Kippur. Hananiah ben Tradion, I'm going to call him Hanina ben Tradion, as he's also referred to as Hanina ben Tradion. His death is brutally described, or very explicitly described. He was executed by fire, and the story goes that his executioner lessened the burden to hasten his death. It's a very moving story, but he lived and operated during the time of Roman occupation of Palestine, and after Bar Kokhba led a revolt against Rome, the Romans became much more harsh in their policies towards any Jew who attempted to further teach about Judaism and Jewish life. Sadly, not only did Bruriah's father die by execution, but her mother as well. Her mother also was killed by the Romans. She had a couple of siblings. They are of questionable character. And then she suffers tragedy, as we will see, with two of her sons. Bruriah was also the wife of Rabbi Meir, one of the great rabbis of the rabbinic period, again in the 2nd century. So that's a little bit about who Bruriah was. We're going to take a look at a few texts just to give a glimpse into the character of this great sage. The first text is from the Babylonian Talmud, and it has to do with a conversation that Bruriah had with another one of the great sages, Rabbi Yossi HaGalili, Rabbi Yossi the Galilean, who was going along the road, this traveling, and he met Bruriah. And he said to her, "By which road shall we go to Lud?" His destination was a certain community in Palestine, and so he asked what ostensibly is an innocent question. But Bruriah said to him, "Galilean fool," already gives you a glimpse into her sharpness. Did not the sages say, and this is a quote from Pirkei Avot, the sayings, the wisdom of our sages, "Do not talk too much with a woman." You should have said, instead of "By which road shall we go to Lod?" you simply should have said, "By which to Lod?" What Bruriah is doing is taking one of the, in my mind, more suspect teachings of the sages about not engaging in frivolous conversation with women. It really was quite critical of women in general, claiming that women cannot sustain a scholarly conversation. Therefore, if you engage in conversation with them, you'll just be mired in gossip. I'm glad this is not one of my favorite teachings, one that I don't promote, but Bruriah uses this rabbinic teaching in a kind of satirical manner to put back in Rabbi Yossi's face a teaching which he ignores. If the teaching in Pirkei Avot argues that or claims that one should not have a lengthy conversation with a woman, Rabbi Yossi HaGalili, the Galilean, ignored that tradition or forgot about it, because his question to her was, by which road shall we go to Lod? Bruriah immediately hears the question, recognizes that he could have condensed that question and simply said, by which to Lod, and thereby fulfilling the teaching, do not engage in lengthy conversation with a woman. So we see here Bruriah's sharp wit. We see that she stands her ground, and not only stood her ground against men in general, but here she stands her ground with one of the great sages of the time. Bruriah did not shrink from any kind of controversy or any dialogue in which she believed she could teach a lesson to these men who often excluded women from their intellectual conversations. So again, sharp wit, standing up for herself, and it gives us a clear illustration of Bruriah's character. There is another teaching which I will not share, but in it the text claims that she derided an individual, a disciple, a student. She derided him, criticized him for whispering a lesson rather than saying it out loud. The text suggests that maybe the word derided is a little bit more passive, and she didn't just deride him verbally, but actually she kicked him. I'm sure not in any kind of injurious fashion, but just in a way to gently chastise him for, again, ignoring another teaching, whispering when he should have been speaking in a clear voice. And she cites a verse as proof text of her argument, to support her argument. Again, Bruriah was one who not only was sharp-witted, but who was willing to be outspoken when necessary. I remember in rabbinical school, we had two kinds of teachers. There were the mild-mannered teachers who were patient with students, respectful of them, and then there were the other scholars who, in the course of their teaching, tried to demonstrate how much we didn't know, that we were just lowly students who knew very little compared to this great scholar. There were lessons in humility, and I might have preferred Bruriah being less hostile here, but I recognize that living in a man's world and being part of an environment in which women were often excluded from intellectual circles, I very much understand why Bruriah would be quite passionate in responding to a male student who simply did not know the law, did not know the teachings. And here she was, Bruriah, a wise woman, an intelligent woman, who was often excluded, and her gender was excluded from this type of discourse. She was emphatic in calling attention to how this male disciple was not familiar with Jewish sources. So that's a second teaching. So third one, which again, some of these texts clearly reflect tragic circumstances. This is one which does so as well, and it includes her parents, but I'm sharing it to illustrate how Bruriah was also an intense woman of faith. another another matter. So the Midrash is going to it's going to offer commentary on a phrase which or phrases which actually are part of our burial ceremony. When we bury someone and we make a statement recognizing God's ultimate justice. Hatsur Tamim Polo begins. The rock, God's work is perfect. So there's a commentary here on those words. Again, those words were an expression of being resigned to God's justice, accepting our fate, and embracing faith even in the most trying and tragic circumstances. So on these words, the rock, referring to God, God's work is perfect. When they arrested Rabbi Hanina ben Tradion, he was sentenced to be burned together with his book. They said to him, "You have been sentenced to be burned with your book." And how does he respond? He responds by reciting this verse, "The rock, God's work is perfect." And continues saying, "For all God's ways are justice." He responds to his impending execution by placing his faith in God's justice. So now the respondents, or the executioners, the Romans, I believe, address his wife, and they say, "Your husband has been sentenced to be burned, and you have been sentenced to be killed." How does his wife respond? Again, a verse, the continuation of the verse quoted by Rabbi Hanina. "A God of faithfulness and without iniquity, just and right." It's actually a verse from the Torah, but it's a verse from the Torah, but the verses were incorporated into our the ritual at cemetery burial. But here again, both of Bruriah's parents accept God's justice, tragic though it may be. So now they come to Bruriah, and they say to her, "Your father has been sentenced to be burned, your mother to be killed, and you have been sentenced to do work." Imagine this would be some kind of hard labor. It would be something she would have to do with, it would be quite rigorous. How does she respond? She also responds by quoting a verse from Jeremiah, "Great in counsel and mighty in deed, whose eyes are open to all the ways of people, rewarding everyone according to his ways and according to the fruit of his doings." So here, what she does is she takes this circumstance, she takes the fact of her parents' impending demise, and she takes the reality of her future servitude, and she offers a verse in which she expresses ultimate faith in God for doing what is just. Now we may question this kind of response, as we have objected to and questioned in future times, certainly during the Holocaust, where the question came up about physical resistance as opposed to spiritual resistance. That physical resistance enabled us at least to fight back, even without any opportunity to triumph over the Nazis. But our tradition is filled with this kind of spiritual resistance to our oppressors, because the spiritual element of it is also what enables us to go on and to live. And despite all of the eras of oppression, Judaism has continued and survived, in large part because, while we're not arguing the merits of physical resistance to oppression, people like Bruriah and her parents reacted in a way in which they accepted God's justice, but they passed down that tradition as a model for future generations to ensure that no matter what may transpire, Judaism will survive, our Torah will survive. And so we see that Bruriah here really is a woman who is blessed with an inner peace. she does survive, and she becomes one of the great sages of all Jewish history. So while we might initially be critical of her seemingly passive response, Bruriah makes a commitment not only to survive, but to go on and to become one of the great leaders. And her example is something that we praise today. So moving now to two other sources, and again, these two are going to also reflect more tragic circumstances. One returns to the execution of her father, Rabbi Hanina ben Tradion. Our masters taught, when Rabbi Yossi ben Kizma took sick, Rabbi Hanina or Rabbi Hananya ben Tradion came to visit him. Now remember the time that this is all taking place. The Romans are the Roman Empire is dominant, and they're dominant in Palestine, and they oppress. Over the course of time, becomes gradual, but gradually they begin to impose more restrictions on the Jewish community, including when it comes to study or public assemblies, where study would be featured. They, the Roman authorities, found Rabbi Hanina ben Tradion sitting and engaging in Torah, convening public assemblies, and a Torah scroll was in his breast pocket. The Romans at a point had banished the study of Torah. They brought him, wound the Torah scroll around him, surrounded him with bundles of twigs, and set them on fire. Here's the more gruesome element of his execution. They brought wood sponges, soaked them in water, and laid them on his breast so that he would not die quickly. His daughter, Bruriah, said to him, "Father, how can I see you like this?" So clearly she was there. This was carried out in front of her, and she expresses an obvious emotion that you would expect from anyone in this circumstance. So her father says to her, "If I were being burned alone, the matter would be hard for me. But now that I am burned together with the Torah scroll, he who seeks to avenge the humiliation of the Torah scroll will seek to avenge my humiliation." So here we see that perhaps father and daughter are not so passive and not simply quoting verses and accepting God's justice, but Bruriah's father offers both words of consolation, but I also believe a charge to his daughter to take some kind of future action. He says to her, "Don't worry, I'm not alone. I'm here with the Torah scroll." And at this time, there is a twofold humiliation. One is my humiliation, and the other humiliation of the Torah scroll, which really is symbolic for all of Judaism. The Torah scroll represents the Jewish people, and they're gone. So he says to her, avenging the humiliation of the Torah scroll will also cause me to be avenged. What is the message? We could discuss this and argue different possibilities, but I believe that his charge to Bruriah was to go on, not only to survive, but to carry on Jewish tradition. By carrying on Jewish tradition, you will ensure the survival of our Torah. You will reverse the humiliation to the Torah, and by living, by learning, and by teaching, by perpetuating Judaism, you will not only avenge Judaism and the Jewish people, but you will avenge me. So Bruriah is charged with that responsibility, and I think that that's something that should not be minimized. The modern Jewish theologian, philosopher Emil Fackenheim spoke about the 614th commandment. The Torah describes 613 commandments. The 614th commandment, according to Fackenheim, was do not grant Hitler a posthumous victory, meaning do not allow for the demise of Judaism, because it is not just the death of individuals, even millions of them, but rather the death of Judaism, which Hitler desires. And therefore, we must perpetuate Jewish life in whatever form, however we may observe, not to allow Hitler to triumph. And I think that is reflected in this teaching here. Do not allow the Romans to triumph over us. And the best way that that can be expressed is through the perpetuation of Torah and the perpetuation of Jewish life. And Bruriah certainly honors that request throughout the rest of her life. The last text is perhaps the most tragic of all of them, but I offer it because, again, I think it's during these moments of tragedy, these moments of great of obstacle, that people like Bruriah become much more admired for their courage, for their quintessential faith, and being the quintessential people of faith. So here is a story about the tragic death of the two sons of Bruriah and her husband, Rabbi Meir. Now, Bruriah is the one who is going to be doing the talking, and I'm going to share this revealing and emotional text with you. The text begins, it's from a homily based on the book of Mishlei, the book of Proverbs. And one of the most famous, if not the most famous, paragraph in all of the book of Proverbs is the paragraph known as the Eshet Chayil, the woman of valor. It's a paragraph which is often recited by men in honor of their partners on Friday nights, among other times. So here is a commentary based on these words, a good wife who can find. How is that expressed in reality? What's the proof text for those words? It once happened that Rabbi Meir was sitting and lecturing in the house of study on Sabbath afternoon, something he was wont to do as one of the great rabbis of his generation. And his two sons died. We are not told here anything about their death. There are no details, just that they died. What did their mother, that is Bruriah, do? She laid the two of them on the bed and spread a sheet over them. After the departure of the Sabbath, Rabbi Meir came home from the house of study. He said to her, "Where are my two sons?" She said, "They went to the house of study." He said, "I was watching the house of study, and I did not see them." He knows something is a little fishy here. She gave him a cup for Havdalah, that is the ceremony by which we conclude the Sabbath, and he recited the Havdalah prayer. He again asked, "Where are my two sons?" She said to him, "They went to another place and will soon come." She set food before him, and he ate and blessed. After he blessed, she said, "Master," she referred to him this way as a sign of respect, "I have a question to ask you." He said to her, "Ask your question." She then said, "Master, some time ago, a man came and gave me something to keep for him. Now he comes and seeks to take it. Shall we return it to him or not?" Rabbi Meir said to her, "Daughter," and again he doesn't mean this to belittle her, it was considered a term of endearment, "whoever has an object in trust must return it to its owner." Rabbi Meir is explaining what the law is, not realizing that Bruriah is being rhetorical here. Bruriah knows what the response is, but this is a means of engaging him in the kind of conversation which would perhaps bring him the only measure of consolation possible. She then said, "Master, I would not have given it to him without your knowledge." What did she do? She took him by the hand and led him up to the room. She led him to the bed and removed the sheet that was on them. You can imagine the display of emotion here. When he saw the two of them lying dead on the bed, he began to cry and say, "My sons, my sons." And Bruriah, all of this time, certainly felt this great emotion, but practiced some kind of self-restraint. The text does not give us any indication of her emotional state, but we can't even imagine what it must have been, how it must have been. At that time, Bruriah said to Rabbi Meir, "Master, did you not say to me that I must return the trust to its master?" He said, "The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." This is, she says to Rabbi Meir, you said that I have to return this trust. And the response given, God gave and God has taken away, is also the phrase that we declare when we do the kriyah, when we cut the ribbon or cut our clothing at a time of death. It's an expression of mourning. Once more, it's an indication of the acceptance of God's justice. But now here is the final statement from Rabbi Hanina, who said, "In this way she comforted him," giving kind of like a summary and an explanation, an observation about her intentions. "In this way she comforted him, and his mind was set at ease. And therefore, regarding such an instance does it say, a good wife who can find." The best commentary on those words, Eshet Chayil, a good wife who can find, is the example of Bruriah through her response to her husband at this most tragic time. Now, certainly there are no adequate words of comfort or consolation, and heaven forbid that any one of us should be in this position. But I think Bruriah was an exception in finding the only means to any kind of consolation, both for her husband and for herself. First of all, she allows him to come home and to complete the ritual of the end of Sabbath ritual and food, and we might find this callous or even cruel, rather than just going to get him immediately and telling him what had occurred. But I think that there is a subtle message here that somehow she's setting the table before revealing the tragedy to her husband. Life is going to be difficult enough with the knowledge of the loss of the two boys. However, the choice is either to succumb to this tragedy or to ultimately go on living. And I think her manner here was to first set the pattern for the future. Life must go on. The lesson for the future: life will go on. We will be beset by this tragedy, affected by this tragedy throughout our lives, but nevertheless, we need to find the means of going on. Judaism was never intended to only be a faith during times of flourishment. It also had to be a faith in times of tragedy. And I think that's what she tried to convey by not revealing to him immediately what had happened, but rather enabling him to go through these rituals and to continue, at least symbolically, some semblance of life. I think the other message, one message among others, is that she, by defining her children as a borrowed treasure, She was conveying the idea of Judaism, of life being temporal, that we are put on this earth for a brief period of time. We cannot predict the long-term future, and frankly, we should not agonize over the future. We should not be so afraid of the future that we become victimized by it, and therefore we don't live. And her words here suggest that they both, even with this horrible, horrible tragedy before them, they had a gift. The gift was in the form of their sons. They were able to cherish their sons, to enjoy them, and nothing being promised. They were blessed with two boys who enriched their lives and brought them much happiness, and they need to celebrate their lives and celebrate the good they brought into the family. That needs to be just as they need to be just as mindful of that as they are about the sadness that certainly they will always express. So Bruriah is a woman of great insight, a passionate woman, a woman of sharp wit, a woman who, led by her wisdom, she was able to stand her ground with anyone, with any of the great male sages of the time. But she was also a woman of tremendous faith, of pathos, and therefore I believe it is necessary and important for us to revive the traditions of Bruriah, to know about her, to teach her texts, and to ensure that she always be included among the great teachers of our tradition. Once again, in anticipation of Shavuot, Chag Sameach.